Welcome to the Center for International and Regional Studies at Georgetown University in Qatar. This podcast series is part of the Energy Humanities Research Initiative. The project aims to generate new scholarly conversations on everyday lived experiences of energy.
Welcome to the Everyday Energy podcast series from Georgetown University in Qatar. In the second part of the third episode in our podcast series on aesthetic and narrative representations of lived experiences of oil, we are with Stacey Balkan and Swaralipi Nandi to talk about their co-edited volume titled Oil Fictions, World Literature and Our Contemporary Petrosphere. Stacey Balkan is Associate Professor of Environmental Literature and Humanities at Florida Atlantic University. She is the author of Rogues in the Postcolony, Narrating Extraction and Itinerancy in India, and is currently working on a new book project which investigates the racialized frontiers of extractive capitalism titled Black Anthropocene Vistas. Swaralipi Nandi is an assistant professor of English at Loyola College, Hyderabad, India. In addition to Oil Fictions, she is the co-editor of two books on postcolonial literature and film, and is currently focusing on extractivism and colonial commodity frontiers of India in Bengali fictions of wood, coal, and indigo. Stacey and Swaralipi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, I was impressed by your very first opening sentence of your co-edited volume. Oil Fictions, you write, is a transnational collaborative project with its editors and contributors located in diverse global contexts and connected through metaphorical pipelines of an increasingly precarious environment. Can you please elaborate on the value and challenges of collaborative transnational work in energy humanities?
First, I want to say thank you again, Firat. This is wonderful. And Swaralipi and I are having our first opportunity to collaboratively celebrate and talk about this collection. I'm so happy.
Well, glad to bring you virtually together.
Yes, I know. And of course, our collaboration, was real. It continues to be really amazing, and we're of course working from, very distant geographic regions. So first, I should mention that I think more collaborative work is essential across the academy more broadly. Frankly, the emphasis on individual publication for career advancement, in my mind, seems to only buttress the neoliberalization of the academy, whereby the fruits of our labor are pursued in large measure in the interest of market value. Of course, I say this from a very recently tenured position, literally last week. So, I know full well the precarity of our world, but this still concerns me deeply. So it seems that, this kind of toxic individualism that's of course central to consumer capitalism and here in the States, sort of American persona more broadly, ought to be at odds with what we do in the academy, in the classroom, and surely in the field of energy humanities, which is an interdisciplinary project that not only produces, syllabi and journal articles, but which is genuinely and actively engaged in the world-making project of energy justice for historically marginalized communities, right? So toward that end, in our work, we also seek to make legible the oppressive political structures of carbon modernity and their disastrous impacts on Earth systems through cultural expression, right? And it seems to me, if we are in fact to transition away from the oppressive political structures of petromodernity, right, the form of our work ought to reflect this shift. Right? Thank you, and I'll give it to Swaralipi.
Well, transnational work in energy humanities is definitely the need of the hour. And as we mentioned in our preface, that we editors connected over a common concern for a shared living in the real world. I remember we conceptualized All Fictions in 2017 from our common concerns about environmental catastrophes and as far as I remember, there was this series of devastating hurricanes and consequent evacuation in Stacey's community in South Florida, while in my hometown in Telangana, India was sweltering from unprecedented temperature extremes and devastating floods too, which were reported from other parts of India. So 5 years down the line, our concerns remain the same. Because though distinct, these catastrophes refer to the debilitating effects of fossil capitalism, extractivist regimes, and feckless development that characterize the global ramifications of what Jason Moore calls as the age of the Capitalocene. So definitely, I mean, this is something that informs our work even now. And we see that oil fictions particularly aims at grappling with the ubiquity of oil and the global pervasiveness of fossil fuels in ushering and sustaining cultures of capitalistic modernity, which are built on the decimation of local ecologies and thriving on uneven geographies. There are, of course, challenges in locating common coordinates, especially given the disjunctive temporalities of fossil energy, and particularly a polyphony of discourses or energy that is available in different contexts. However, a transnational collaborative study like this not only aims at grappling with the magnitude of global petrocultures, but it also seeks to inculcate an aesthetics of planetarity about a shared future beyond any kind of geopolitical boundaries.
I know I wanted to add something earlier too, and that
Please.
we co-produced the CFP for our book, right, during both of us being literally shuttered by climate disaster was a perfect representation of the urgency of this kind of work. There are lots of wonderful examples of this sort of collaboration of the kind that we do, right? And so in addition to what Swaralipi is talking about, right, there's similar collaborations to that of oil fictions, for example, the publications of the After Oil Collective, which I also see is really vital to our continued work. And another recent example of collaborative work that I wanted to mention here too, that I find particularly inspiring in terms of its form, is actually the duograph authored by Rice University anthropologists and co-hosts of Cultures of Energy, right? Or the podcast Cultures of Energy, sorry, Dominic Boyer and Simone Howe. Entitled Wind and Power, the Anthropocene, wherein the two anthropologists offer their unique ethnographic accounts of the same fieldwork in order to engage with different and variously nuanced approaches to, in this case, the virtues and vices of corporate wind parks, which is yet another example of green capitalism that essentially reproduces the violent and ergo politics of petrocapitalism, right? And then, of course, I mentioned the After Oil Collective, and whose works are collaborative, bear no single name, no single author name, and which I think also represents a way, really productive way in which we might disarticulate our academic work and our activism from, what I mentioned earlier as a sort of kind of the impulse to kind of individualize, right? That seems imminent to the neoliberal academy.
Well, if I may add to what Stacey said, that we are constantly engaging in all kinds of interdisciplinary dialogues. So we are looking into energy humanities, energy histories, energy anthropology, energy politics, and then we obviously have works on energy and culture. So we are constantly looking at each other, working with each other, conversing with each other, and so it's not only transnational, but also interdisciplinary in terms of where we are going and how we are making sense of the whole field through borrowing from each other and learning from each other. I think it is quite interesting to say energy humanities vis-a-vis other fields of study, especially as Stacey mentioned about activism. Energy humanities is collaborating with critical indigenous studies, what Carriou calls, as to quote him, indigenized philosophy of energy, which indicates prospects for future studies that are numerous and absolutely exciting.
Although you rightfully point out at the specific aspects of the lived experiences of energy in the global north and the global south, you also call for establishing a dialogical, contrapuntal connection between the two. Can you elaborate on this point, please? And it seems that this is part of the transnational collaboration vision as well, right?
Well, I think we first need to complicate the distinction between global north and global south, right? Because many communities in the global north, suffer similar forms of resource colonization and consequently material dispossession, right? In addition to violent forms of displacement. So in that sense, we can consider a myriad of pipeline projects in the Dakotas and across the Midwest, new calls for the mining of precious metals, right, in the southwestern US, the exploitation of workers in Appalachia, who are consistently invoked in, sorts of exploitative political campaigns by, violent populist leaders. And then here at home, very close to my heart, the sort of, horrific forms of environmental injustice that are happening in Central Florida, in the agricultural industries, soaring asthma rates because of big sugar, and then ultimately, forms of mobility injustice here, including something I write about a lot, which is like the racialized siting of bicycle lanes, so the distinction needs to be kind of troubled, but at the same time, of course, the distinction is often made to indicate the difference between what a lot of folks understand as sort of sites of consumption and sites of production, right? Or sites of consumption and then extractive zones, as we were sort of talking about earlier. And so sort of sites of production and consumption, insofar as sites like the Niger Delta, for example, are ostensibly invisible to consumers in the United States, right? That works like those of poet, slain activist, somebody like Ken Saro-Wiwa, right? Or more recently, Cameroonian novelist Mbolo Mbui, right? That work like that sort of makes legible, right? The otherwise, what we read, we talk about as a sort of incommensurable aporia, right? Between these two contrapuntal sites. And I think part of our project, of course, and our teaching, right, because it seems critical to put these two sites in conversation. So I know in the classroom, I often try to conjoin these two putatively disconnected sites in discussions about sort of the broader cartographies of contemporary geopetropolitics, right? And I see this, of course, as critical to making legible the extractive zones of global capital, right? And ultimately to exposing what are the obvious human costs of our overdependence on fossil fuels. And I might just say one more thing. I don't want to talk too much. I want to give Swaralipi an opportunity. I was going to say too, it's been interesting lately to see, of course, these horrific images of Ukraine flooding social media, popular cable news outlets and such, and here in the States, watching, as the United States Congress for the first time has to stand and bear witness, right, to the human cost of, in this case, like our overdependence on Russian gas, and so this, so part of, I get, the thrust of the project is kind of to bring these sites into conversation. And of course, in the energy humanities, we look at cultural expressions to make these places more legible. But I think what's happening lately, I shudder to say this, but is perhaps an opportunity, right, to kind of move beyond this dystopian present. And I'll stop there.
Well, absolutely. I mean, while I do acknowledge northern and southern environmental concerns are more overlapping than distinct, I would like to agree more with Stacey's last statement on the distinction between the sites of production and the sites of consumption that play out against imbalances created by colonial histories. Because we see that petrocapitalism deeply entrenches on the precarity of the post-colonial states in the global south, and it operates on a global network of transnational labor, often invisibilized, whose roots are drawn along imperial histories of human migration. For example, the kafala labor system that we get to see in many of the Gulf countries, which denies citizenship right and other basic rights to the migrants going there. So, situating energy humanities in the global south, this entails a more informed focus on this invisible petrolabor as the human cost of extractive energy systems that replicate slave economies through overt parallels of borderless labor extrication from the global fringes. So, as I was mentioning, the case in point being the multitudes of kafala laborers from South Asia and the Gulf states who are characterized by undocumented migrancy and vulnerability. We need to forge a petrocritical paradigm that engages more actively with the question of labor in an oil economy, a trope that has been substantially missing in the existing discourse on petrocultures in the North. It is this discursive spaces that we have attempted to address in our book Oil Fictions, and we hope to see more dialogic scholarship on energy in future. Thank you.
May add to that too, right? I mean, there's a significant, it was critical to sort of engage in a post-colonial intervention, right, into sort of popular energy humanities discourse. And so far as Swaralipi was just saying, right, there's sort of huge, I mean, what we argued, right, in our introduction, there's sort of huge lacuna in terms of like attention to, not only invisible networks of fossilized energy, but of course, invisible networks of forced labor, right, that indeed follow, right, the imperial trajectory of colonial era labor practices, right, and continue, right, I think we were talking earlier this morning, right, continue to sort of operate with these same kinds of logics. And if I can just say, I know we don't have a great deal of time, but several of the chapters in the book, including Swaralipi's, right, like attend very specifically to the South Asian context, thinking about forced labor regimes and essentially, tracing the genealogy of the genealogies of the different petrostates, right, from their origins in these exploitative colonial era economies, right. And so, I think what we've accomplished to a great extent, right, and I'm really proud of the work. Although, of course, I love our afterword, like, yeah, it's really exciting. And of course, our afterword by Imre Zeman, he says, no, we have to, obviously we have to keep going. Where do we go from here, right? But I think the essays really speak to all of the different ways in which it's so critical to consider how these different cultural expressions really do make legible, the sort of vast extractivist frontiers that are ostensibly invisible. And I get, and I want to, if I can, just to say that I guess I, talked about not making the easy distinction, but I should say that, of course, the distinction obviously needs to be made. I think sometimes, is that we make the distinction without thinking about the ways in which they're intimately connected, right, in these really spectacularly violent and uneven ways.
Thank you. On that note, another, I think, quite interesting moment of contrapuntal connection appears in your volume in relation to global energy systems on the one hand and world literature on the other, right? As the title of your volume suggests, you attempt to interpret and theorize oil fictions as world literature. And clearly, this doesn't mean a cartographic sampler of oil-themed literature from different parts of the world. Rather, you identify a relationship between hydrocarbon and literary modes of production in terms of what you aptly call their metaphoric liquidity of consumption and extraction, forming a truly transnational web of debilitating structures of domination. So could you please tell us more about what petrocultural studies and world literature studies learn from each other? And I think in relation to that, if in the final analysis, world literature is about mimesis, as pioneers of the field such as Eric Auerbach would insist, how does then literature best address oil's resistance to representation? So, I think another way of thinking about the relationship between world literature studies and petrocultural studies is around the intersections between fossil capitalism and narrative form. Right?
Sure.
So is there a way out of mimesis?
Well, a distinct objective of oil fictions has been to explore literature on petroleum as world literature. And that means not only just in terms of various geographical regions focusing on the ubiquity of oil, but also looking at the varied cultural responses to petroleum in the post-colonial states. So, echoing Amitabh Kumar's proposal that he talks about in terms of defining world literature, he says, let us revise the term from world literature to World Bank literature, hoping that it will constitute a call of arms to analyze literature that deals with new global realities. So, oil fictions invokes a comparative paradigm of transnational cultures of fossil capitalism against the new realities of economic globalization. So, our initial engagement with the field made us realize that petrocultural discourse has largely been tethered to the cultural production in the global north, and it has therefore been a central aim of this volume to engage with petrofictions in a variety of post-colonial and world literature milieux. So, we have had, contributions and essays from African, context of Africa, South American contexts, South Asian, Middle Eastern, and transnational encounters addressing the all pervasive oil economy. A major focus of this volume has been to foreground the human cost of petroleum extraction, while also grappling with the vexed categories of what we can call as human and nature, because those real abstractions that have lost long sustained global capitalism. So, our volume engages with literature that represents a trajectory of imperial power imbalance as well as the extractive labor regimes of the transnational petroeconomy. Now, along with the comparative material conditions of oil economies, what oil fictions also does is that it marries petrocultural studies and world literature studies in discussion of heterogeneous literary forms. To borrow from M. D. Zeman, we seek what he calls as, I'm quoting him, a new critical sensibility in our analysis of world literature, or the world literary system that permits us to understand how every social practice, cultural form, and political expression is animated by the sheer energetic capacities and seemingly boundless excesses of fossil fuels. In the volume subsequently, we also propose in the lines of Franco Moretti a kind of a new critical method of reading texts, which is hinged on the idea of a combined and unequal development of literary texts across transnational cultures. So, to quote Moretti, he says, one and equal, one literature, well literate, singular as Goethe and Marx would say, or perhaps better, one world literary system or interrelated literatures, but a system that's profoundly unequal, close quotes. So, emphasizing on the centrality of narrative prose and exploring the trajectory of the rise of the modern novel as a compromise between the Western formal influence and local materials. Essays in this volume address what Moretti calls as, again I'm quoting, a unique tripartite comparative paradigm of world literature as a literature of the modern capitalist world system, with the foreign form, local material, and local form, which all collate together in unique interferences, asymmetries of materialist asymmetries of circulation and exchange of world literature in the context of reading world economic relations. What is also interesting about the volume is that there are certain essays in the collection that look at this heterogeneity of form beyond mimesis. For example, if we take the example of Corbin Ihedai's essay in our collection, which offers a unique reading strategy of thinking of absence as a trope within a particular set of novels. So the twofold absence, he argues, is combined with a particular articulation of spatiality, which further reveals a disillusionment and stasis which are structurally embedded in what Hadai's understanding of contemporary petromodernity is. Apart from reading strategies, let me talk a little bit about the contributions in this volume that focus on this particular question of literary forms in the structure of the text. So our approach is primarily informed by the Warwick Research Collective's theorization of combined and uneven development that invokes, to quote, the connection between capitalist modernity and the literary forms through the core semi-peripheral and peripheral literary traditions of the world literary systems. indubitably uneven but connected by a common mediation of literature in the lived experience of capitalism's bewildering creative destruction, close quote. So subsequently for the literary coordinates of the text written in an uneven environment that retain the patchwork origins of their local or regional cultural ecology can be witnessed in the discrepant encounters, alien effects, surreal cross linkages, unidentified freakish objects. So they quote these instances in their polemic. Well, they're talking about semi-peripheral and peripheral literary traditions. So similarly, in our collection also there are several essays that discuss texts that display such unevenness in form. So there is the magical, the uncanny, irrealist, folklorish indigenous traces that are blended with realism. So again, we can take the example of Wendy Walter's essay that discusses the works of Okorafor, whose Spider the Artist is a text where artificially intelligent cyber spiders guard pipelines and dismember interfering humans. While again, we can talk about Simon Ryle's essay on Negastain's Cyclopedia, which analyzes the paranoid speculative terms of the novel that projects oil with demonic agency. My essay, for example, in the collection on Unni Krishnan's magic realist text in Mufasa Group People discusses irrealist modes of representing the otherwise invisible Indian petrolabel in the Gulf. And these and several other literary musings move beyond the mimetic reflection to instead explore fossil capitalism narrative forms which attest to peripheral realisms. So there are actually endless ways to tap oil beyond realism in spite of its elusive form.
Thank you, Swaralipi. It was great. And maybe just to add something really quickly to that point, and then maybe kind of think about this other question regarding, right, mimetic readings, right? Like how we actually, Swaralipi was talking about the ways in which, right, several of the chapters, right, engage with different cultural expressions and different modes of reading. I was thinking also about Shure Deckard's chapter, right, which attends to, or which reads Nawala Sadawi's Love in the Kingdom of Oil, right, which is this like a realist text in which, right, the narrator, right, is kind of literally living in an island of oil, and the ways in which the sort of what we'll call maybe kind of like a petrospectral presence, right, is literally seeping in all around her, right? So we have, the different chapters trace these really, as Swaralipi said, sort of often magical renderings of this otherwise illegible presence, or this otherwise structurally invisible presence of oil and energy, right? And I think toward that end, to also return to Swaralipi also mentioned, the ways in which we think about world energy literature, I guess World Bank literature, right? And the return to Imre Zeman's chapter, it says conjectures on world energy literature. And the only thing I wanted to add, because you've already, said I think what's most significant, and that's that we kind of think about or trouble this category of world and its representations. But I just wanted to add from Zeman's piece too. I love this sentence when he says, one can argue that the world announced by the category of world literature does not in fact come into existence until the beginning of the era of fossil fuels. Right? Production of the imaginary named world, quote, is fueled by the presence of energy sources, including coal and oil, that make the space of the globe increasingly available and accessible to travel, trade, and political power. But anyway, that the world that we're talking about here comes into existence is coterminous, right, with the quote putative birth of carbon capitalism, right? And as post-colonialists, of course, we've long sought to trouble the category of world. I'm thinking about like Feng Che's last book, kind of talking about quote world as a spatial imaginary, right, that's then stratified by artificial temporal lines that are produced by global markets, right? So it's also a category we're trying to trouble. But in terms of then representing that world, which is to say representing a world, both saturated in fossil fuels and also produced by them, right? I think this is like the question of the field, right? How do you actually represent this? How do you actually make legible something like what I guess I called, and by the way, I stole that term, the petrospectral presence. I was just teaching Pablo Neruda's wonderful poem, Standard Oil, the other evening. So it's a wonderful, where he also uses the term petroliferous, which are, but but sort of how do you make that felt? How do you make this legible, right? This is something that we're, centrally concerned with in our field. And so, so I guess just to say a couple of things, and of course we talked a little bit about this earlier this morning, right? Sort of, this question of how we read for oils that are no longer, read for oil in ways or in critical ways that are no longer constrained by these like conventional categories of classic literary criticism, and I'm thinking about energy humanist Susan Hattenaker, who writes about coal, this great, she refers to the reductive, like what she calls onto-epistemological containers with which we have long apprehended cultural works, right? So how do we get away from that and conceive of new hermeneutics, if you will, to literally read for oil, or to read for that which is otherwise illegible, right? And this is where, in our field, again, we often talk about forms of structural invisibility. So of course, we're asking, how we read for that. The other thing that, we often think about, right? And, you mentioned form, and we've been talking about form. So like both, how we make this otherwise spectral presence of energy legible, but also like how we understand literary form, right, in different ways, which is to say, as directly produced by the form of this global petrosphere, right? So how we understand plot, for example, not in terms of the sort of banal themes of the modern novel, right, but instead as a production of the material forces that mitigate its every turn, right? And we were talking this morning about a kind of extractive temporality, or a developmentalist temporality, right, which is imminent to popular quote world literature, or sort of the modern novel, the Bildungsroman, and so forth. So how do we read the form itself, right, as adhering with with the sort of temporalities and material realities produced by extractive capitalism. And then I'd say, one other thing we do talk about quite a bit in the book and in the field, right, is sort of how to think about the aesthetics of quote resources, right? And Jeff Diamante and Brent Ryan Bellamy's wonderful book on sort of material critiques of energy, in the introduction, they talk about sort of how resources have historically been seen as having, they say, it's brute matter that literally has no aesthetic whatsoever, right? And as we've talked about here, right, like that these resources are simply brute matter that don't come into being until marshaled into, commodifiable forms or tradable forms, right? And so what we try to also do is sort of think about the aesthetic, the aesthetics of resources themselves, and how those, and sort of the aesthetic, I guess, of or what we might call sort of infrastructural aesthetics. And I'll stop there because I really think we are over time. But thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure we can go, at least 1 hour more, but this was really great. And perhaps, since I am in my Jamesonian moment of announcing dictums, I'll end with all world literature is hydrocarbon literature. How about that?
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Well, Stacey and Swaralipi, I'd like to thank you again for this genuinely enjoyable conversation. And we should definitely do another podcast interview when your next books are out. And who knows, maybe we'll bring you together in Doha in person. That would be even lovelier. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.